Hello and welcome back to Introduction to Programming in Python. In this video we're talking about loops, or in other words, loops. What do they do? Do they do things? Let's find out. In Python there are two main types of loops. Both are used to iterate over some code. This do stuff that you see in the for loop and while loop is really a block of code that we're going to do multiple times based on the type of loop we use. In a second we're going to talk about for loops and while loops. We'll use while loops if we want to iterate until something happens. We'll use for loops if we know the number of times we want to iterate. And by iterate, I just mean taking the same code and running it over and over and over again with slightly different inputs. We're going to start with while loops, and in this example, we're using while loops to sanitize user input. We are going to use the phrase sanitize because oftentimes people mistype things or type the wrong things. For example, if we want them to enter their name and they enter a phone number, we'll need to check that and reprompt them for their name. In this example, we're making things really easy. We want them to enter the number 5. So while the number is not equal to 5, we're going to prompt them again to enter 5. We can look at this line by line. We start by setting number equals to -1. This is like an invalid value. It lets us know they haven't entered a number yet. And then we check whether or not that number is not equal to 5. Well, that's true, it is not equal to 5, so we jump inside the while loop, and we prompt them to the shell, please input 5. If they type the number 5, we'll store that result in number, and we'll come up here and check. Well, number is not equal to 5, so that means our condition on the while loop is false, which means instead of going into the while loop, we'll jump all the way down to the next regular command, the regular line that's not inside the while loop, and we'll print out finally. We could also write a while loop that has nothing to do with user input. For example, we could start I equals 0, and as long as I is less than 10, we'll print it out and increment it by 1. So that prints out the numbers 0 through 9, but there's a much better way to do this, and that's where for loops come in. This is a for loop that does the exact same thing, and let's look at the while loop and the for loop side by side to see their differences. In the first line of our while loop example, we make a new variable called I. And we do that in the for loop, except it's in the statement. So we're starting out with I, and we're starting with 0 being the value of I. In the for loop, that's our first range parameter. So range is going to be a command that has some start value and some end value. Here's the start and here's the end. So we're looping as long as I is less than 10. So it's important to note that although when you see range 0, 10, you might think the number 0 including 10, it's actually all the numbers from 0 to 9. And then we print out I, and in the while loop we have to write I plus equals 1, but the for loop will take care of that for us. If we wanted to make that plus equals 2, we could add another parameter or another argument to the range command. We could add a third number right there, and now we're looping every other number. There are two main keywords that are important in the world of loops, and that would be break and continue. The break command is used to break out of a loop. In this example, our program is going to take commands from the user and do different things based on different commands. But if they type quit, we no longer want to see commands anymore. Now we wrote while true, and because true is always equal to true, that while loop will loop no matter what. And unless we hit the break command that's inside our if statement. This means if command is equal to quit, we'll break out of the loop and we'll probably end our program or do some cleanup afterwards. The continue statement, instead of breaking out of the loop, just jumps back to the front of the loop. So in this example, if they type skip, we won't print out the command. Instead, we're going to jump to the beginning of the while loop and ask them for their input again. Now, in my opinion, the continue keyword isn't all that useful because we could often write it as just an if statement. And this code has one less line, in my opinion, is easier to read and does the exact same thing. But it's important to note that a lot of things in programming, especially in Python, are a matter of personal preference and what you believe is more readable. If you think this previous code is more readable for other human beings, then this is how you should write it. And over time, you'll be able to have a better sense of what that means for you and the programs that you write. Now, there's a huge warning that I need to say before we go off onto our own programming examples. And this is something that every programmer does. It is an infinite loop. For example, how many times are we going to print hi in the following code? Well, the answer is we're going to print hi until we kill our program. How many times are we going to print I in this code? Well, we're going to print the number 0 as many times as we can before the programmer shows up and says, oh crap, I have a bug. How do we fix this? Well, if we type Control-C, hold Control and type C as if you were copying, if we do that while we're in the Python shell, it'll just interrupt and kill whatever program we have running. And I think that's pretty important, especially when you're learning to program, that you know this quick fix. So without further ado, let's move into a programming example. In this example, we're going to ask the user for a number and print out all of the factors of that number. Now, if you don't remember your elementary school algebra, a number's factors are all of the integers which, when you multiply them together, give you that number. So our code is going to ask the user to give us a number, and we're going to loop through all of the possible factors, checking to figure out which ones actually do multiply together to give us that number. And if we find any factors, we'll make sure to print them out. So let's start doing that. The first thing we need is a number. And let's set it equal to -1 because the user hasn't entered anything yet. Then we're going to ask them for a number, and we want to make sure they give us a positive number. So this says if we have a negative number, we need to ask them for a new one. Actually, that's not entirely true. They could have entered 0, so let's go back. Now it has to have been a positive number. So once we have our positive number, we're going to want to check all of the numbers less than it to figure out if they're a factor. So that's a for loop. Now, we're going to start with the number 1, and we're going to end with the number itself. That means we have to go from 1 to number +1, because if you remember from our slides, this second parameter in the range command, that's 1 bigger than the last number we're going to see. Okay, so now I is one of the numbers between 1 and itself. So if number mod I is equal to 0, that means if you can divide the number by I and have a remainder of 0, that means it's a factor. We can then calculate our two factors. So we're going to have factor 1 is equal to I, and factor 2 is going to be equal to number divided by I. And I'm just using integer division here because we know it's an integer, so why not? Then, because we found our factor, well, let's print that out. Factor 1, factor 2. And if we run our code now, let's see what happens. Please enter a positive number. If I type -1, we totally break. Oh, we totally break because I forgot to cast our input to an integer. That's very important. Now, if we run our code and we have it work, we enter -1 and we've been asked for a number again. So let's enter 2, and we've got the factors of 2 are 1 and 2. Well, that makes sense. Let's come up with a more interesting example. If we come over here and run our code a second time, and I enter the number 42, so what you see on the screen right now are all of the factors of 42, but note that you see each factor 2 times. I'm going to leave it as an exercise for you to go back and edit this code so that you only see each factor appearing once. What we are going to do together is we're going to put a big loop around our code so that we don't actually have to run the program over and over again in order to find more factors of more numbers. So we're going to do this by making a big while true loop around our code, and we got to indent everything. Okay, we can actually highlight everything and press tab to do that indentation, and then we have to ask them if they want to enter another number. So what I've done here is I've got an if statement after our factorization code, which asks if the user would like to go again. They'll enter a string, and that string is returned by the input command. Now, if you remember from our last video about strings, this means that we're going to take the first character from our string, and if this first character is not equal to a y, then we're going to exit the code. Otherwise, if it is equal to a y, we'll come back up to the while true and keep going through. If I run this code, please enter a positive number, 42. Go again, sure. Please enter a positive number, 56. Go again, no. And here we have definitely more usable code that we don't need to run over and over again. That's all I've got for the video this week. Thanks for listening. Hopefully this has been helpful.